Picture yourself descending a set of damp stone steps into the London Underground, not to catch a train, but to survive the night. Above, the city is burning. The sirens have already wailed their terrible warning, and the sky is shaking with the drone of German bombers. You clutch your children's hands, one in each palm, their small fingers trembling but trusting, and you lead them down into the depths of the earth. You don't know if your home will still be standing in the morning. But down here, in the tunnels, you hope there will be life. The first night it felt like trespassing. The underground was meant for trains, not families with blankets and suitcases. I remember the look on the station attendant's face when the crowd pushed forward, not asking but demanding entry. We had nowhere else to go. The Anderson shelter in the garden rattled like a tin can under the blast waves. It was better than nothing, yes, but not enough when the bombs fell closer. The tube promised something stronger. Brick and stone, solid walls, and the comfort of being with others. When we reached the platform at Liverpool Street, the space was already crowded. Families lined along the walls, some curled against iron pillars, others spreading mattresses across the cold tiles. My children stared at the strange sight of people setting up camp where commuters usually waited for trains. A few brave souls tried to keep normality. An elderly man reading his newspaper beneath a flickering light. A woman knitting calmly, though her needles clicked faster whenever the distant thud of bombs echoed down the tunnels. The sound was always there, like thunder rolling through stone. The trains still ran at first, screaming past, their winds knocking loose papers into the air. But as the raids grew heavier, the underground became less of a railway and more of a cavernous shelter. That first night, we barely slept. My youngest whimpered with every boom from above. I told him stories to keep him calm, fairy tales, adventures, but in truth I was telling them to myself as much as to him. The smell of humanity was immediate, damp coats, sweat, tobacco, fear. Yet there was also something reassuring in that closeness. Strangers shared biscuits, tea poured from flasks, and news whispered along the platform like smoke. Nobody knew how long it would last, only that we had stumbled into a new kind of existence, half above ground and half below. I remember one moment with piercing clarity. The ceiling shook as if struck by a giant's fist. Dust rained down from the arches. The children screamed, clutching my arms. Somewhere far above, a bomb had hit, but in the tunnel we were still breathing. People looked at one another with wide eyes, and then, slowly, one by one, began to laugh, not out of joy, but out of sheer relief that we were still alive. That laugh, echoing in the dark, felt like the first fragile sign of courage. The government hadn't planned it this way. They had discouraged us at first, insisting that the tube was not to be used as a shelter. But no order could stop a mother from dragging her children underground when the bombs fell on her street. That night, as we lay against the cold stone wall, I knew the city had changed forever. We were no longer simply residents of London. We had become part of an underground nation, bound together by necessity, defiance, and hope. When morning came, we emerged blinking into the grey daylight. The station stairs led us up until the sky and the acrid smell of smoke met our eyes. Whole streets lay flattened. A shopfront we had passed the previous evening was now a jagged heap of bricks. I held my sons close, not sure whether to be grateful for surviving or terrified of the night to come. But deep inside, I understood something. We would be back. Every evening, as the sirens wailed, we would return to the underground, to our temporary city below the earth. It was not just shelter. It was a promise that while the bombs could fall on our homes, they would not break our will to endure together, hidden in the veins of London itself. The nights in the tube became more than just hiding. After the first weeks, we learned to transform the tunnels into something resembling a community. It was astonishing how quickly human beings adapt when survival demands it. What began as chaos, families fighting for corners, children crying in the echoing dark, evolved into an organized life beneath the ground. At first, we carried nothing but blankets and fear. But soon the wiser families brought camp beds, folding chairs, even little stoves. The platforms became patchworks of makeshift homes, each family staking a claim to a small rectangle of space. Children drew chalk lines on the tiles, as if to say, "This is ours." The most remarkable part was how quickly strangers became neighbors. A man who had once sold newspapers on the corner of Bishopsgate now shared tea with my wife. A grocer from Whitechapel entertained the children with riddles. People formed routines together. Each night, as the sirens wailed, we all descended those same steps, nodding to one another as if returning to familiar streets, except our streets were tunnels lit by flickering bulbs. Over time, services appeared, improvised but essential. Volunteers organized medical posts on the platforms. A nurse in a white apron moved calmly through the crowd, checking on the elderly, dressing small cuts, handing out aspirin. Water taps were installed. Canteens sprouted up where volunteers handed out tea and sandwiches, the smell of warm bread fighting against the damp mineral air. The most surreal sight was the libraries. In some stations, volunteers stacked books along the walls, simple novels, detective stories, children's tales. I'll never forget my son sitting cross-legged beneath the rumble of distant bombs, absorbed in a borrowed copy of Treasure Island. In that moment, the war above felt almost unreal, suspended by the magic of a story underground. And then there was the sound. Not the bombs, that was constant, but the human sound. Singing became our shield. People would burst into songs, sometimes patriotic, sometimes folk tunes, sometimes silly children's rhymes shouted at the top of their lungs to drown out fear. I once heard a mother hush her child, not with words, but by softly humming, "Abide with me," her voice so fragile and steady that the boy's tears stopped. Around them, others joined in, until the platform trembled with hundreds of voices, singing together in defiance of the destruction above. Children, especially, found ways to adapt. They turned the long tunnels into playgrounds. While their parents fretted about raids and rationing, the children chased each other through the arches, their laughter echoing off the tiles. It was reckless, yes, but it reminded us all that life continued even in the shadow of war. The government eventually relented. What had begun as an unplanned invasion of the Tube by ordinary Londoners was gradually accepted. Bunks were installed 3 tiers high, stretching along the platforms like wooden walls. Thousands of people could now sleep more comfortably. Notices were pinned up, rules about cleanliness, smoking, and order. The shelters were no longer just tolerated, they were sanctioned, even encouraged. But despite the improvements, nothing erased the sense that we lived in 2 worlds. The fragile one above, where homes burned and streets collapsed, and the resilient one below, where humanity found ways to breathe, eat, sleep, and even dream together. One evening, as I watched my children drift to sleep on their narrow bunk, I realized we were living through a paradox. The war was meant to destroy, to break us apart, and yet in these tunnels it was forging something unexpected, a community stronger than fear. The underground had become our fortress, our neighborhood, our nation beneath the earth. The night that changed everything began like so many others. The sirens wailed at dusk, sending us hurrying down the familiar steps. By then, descending into the tube had become as routine as brushing our teeth. Grab the blankets, hold the children's hands, keep your eyes low against the curious stares of neighbors. But that night, there was a heaviness in the air. The station was more crowded than usual. Word had spread that the East End had been particularly battered the night before, and families from those neighborhoods were flocking further west, searching for safer ground. By the time we settled onto the platform, every inch of space was taken. Blankets overlapped, people leaned against each other for lack of room. The air grew thick damp, heavy with breath. At first, we distracted ourselves in the usual ways. The children played marbles on the platform edge. Someone produced a harmonica, its shrill notes dancing weakly in the stale air. A group of women told stories about their ration recipes, boasting of cakes made with carrots instead of sugar. People laughed, but the laughter was brittle, fragile. Then the first thud came, a bomb somewhere above. The platform shuddered faintly, dust drifting down from the tunnel roof. The children froze. My daughter clutched my sleeve so hard her nails left marks. A silence swept through the crowd, the kind of silence that comes when hundreds of people hold their breath at once. Another thud, louder. The tiles trembled this time, and a faint crack echoed down the tunnel. Someone whispered, "It's close." And then the noise grew. Dull thumps escalating into crashes, one after another, so near we could hear the bricks above us splitting. The air filled with the acrid scent of dust and smoke, seeping down through the ventilation shafts. The lights flickered, went out for a moment, then blinked back to life, weak and trembling. In the dark, people screamed, and the station became a chorus of voices, crying, shouting, praying. I pulled my children close, pressing their faces into my chest. Around us, mothers clutched infants, old men whispered desperate prayers, volunteers moved quickly with lanterns, calling out, "Stay calm, stay calm." But calm was a fragile thing. We could hear the city being torn apart above us. Every rumble felt like the ceiling itself might collapse. A woman fainted near the stairs. People rushed to help her, fanning her face, offering water. Someone shouted that their home had been hit, though how he could know, sealed underground, I could not say. Panic spread like fire through the crowd. The walls seemed to shrink, the air thinning, the bombs falling closer and closer. And then, silence. The raid moved on, drifting to another part of the city. The ground stopped shaking, the lights steadied. Slowly, cautiously, people uncurled from their protective huddles. A child began to sob, not from pain, but from relief. Someone whispered, "We're still here." It was then that the singing began, not loud, not triumphant, but soft and trembling. A man at the far end of the platform, his face pale, his eyes wet, started to sing, "We'll meet again." His voice cracked on the first notes, but others joined him, timidly at first, then stronger. Soon the entire station hummed with the tune, voices rising from the wreckage of fear. My son, barely old enough to understand the words, mouthed them silently against my shoulder. I held him tighter, feeling his small body tremble, and thought, if the bombs above could not silence us tonight, perhaps nothing ever would. Later, when the all-clear siren wailed and we emerged into the smoke-choked night, the destruction was staggering. Streets I had walked 100 times were gone, reduced to piles of rubble. Fires glowed where houses once stood. But among the survivors there was a strange, shared expression, not of triumph, but of endurance. We had looked terror in the face underground, and we had endured together. That night taught us something we never forgot. The tube was not just a shelter of brick and tile. It was a place where fear was shared, where courage was borrowed from your neighbor, where hope was rebuilt each time the bombs tried to take it away. Not every night underground was safe. The irony was cruel. We descended into the tube to survive, but sometimes tragedy found us even there. I remember hearing about Bethnal Green. It was March 1943, one of the worst nights of the war for those who trusted the shelters. The raid sirens had sounded, and as usual, thousands of East End families surged toward the station, desperate for the safety of the tunnels. People poured down the narrow stairwell, men, women, children, babies carried in arms. And then a single fall in the darkness triggered disaster. One person tripped, another stumbled over them, and in seconds panic rippled through the mass of bodies. In that stairwell, with bombs howling above and fear pressing down, more than 170 lives were lost, not from fire, not from collapse, but from the crush of the crowd itself. When word of it reached us, silence spread through our own station. Mothers clutched their children closer. Men stared at the tiled walls as though they might betray them. The tube, our haven, suddenly seemed fragile, its safety an illusion. Yet even in grief people sought meaning. Priests and ministers spoke of courage, neighbors offered comfort, and those who had survived in other stations insisted that life below must go on because there was nowhere else to go. And still, the tube remained the heartbeat of the city at night. For every tragedy, there were 100 nights of endurance. Families continued to descend the stairs, carrying their bundles of blankets, their tin mugs, their hope. Volunteers patrolled the platforms, not with weapons, but with lanterns and steady voices. Nurses moved quietly, comforting the sick. The tube was not just stone and iron, it was held together by people, ordinary Londoners who chose to show kindness when the world outside was anything but kind. What struck me most was the way life continued underground, despite everything. Children still laughed, still played. Teachers held lessons in the tunnels, scribbling sums on scraps of paper while bombs shook the ceiling above. Some stations had concerts, musicians pulling out violins, harmonicas. Even battered pianos hauled down the steps, playing for a crowd that closed its eyes and pretended, for an hour, that they were in a theater rather than a bunker. Couples courted in the half-light. Babies were born in makeshift hospital corners, their first cries rising above the distant thunder of bombs. There were nights when the shelters felt almost festive. I remember one Christmas Eve underground, when a group of children sang carols beside a paper lantern. Someone had painted holly leaves on a strip of cardboard and pinned it to the wall. For a moment, we forgot the war and felt only the warmth of voices in harmony, echoing down the tiled tunnels. And yet, beneath it all, we never truly forgot what waited above. Each morning, climbing the stairs back into the daylight, we stepped into a different city than the one we had left the night before. Streets were gone, homes reduced to rubble, neighbors missing. The contrast was brutal. Underground we had built something resembling life, but on the surface we confronted loss again and again. Still, the shelters gave us something we had not expected: unity. They were not perfect, not always safe, and sometimes unbearably crowded, but they gave us the gift of facing fear together. In the tube, you were never alone. The neighbor you had once ignored on the street might share their last biscuit with your child. A stranger might hold your hand in the dark, steadying you as the bombs fell. We called it endurance, but it was more than that. It was defiance written in human voices against the silence the enemy tried to impose. The underground was never meant to be a nation, but by the end of the Blitz, that is exactly what it had become. A living, breathing city beneath the city, where courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to go on despite it. The war eventually passed, as all storms do. The bombs fell less often, the sirens grew quieter, and one day the people of London began to climb out of the underground, not for hours, but for good. We returned to our homes, if they still stood, or to the ruins where homes had once been, ready to rebuild. But the underground never left us. Even years later, when the tunnels were once again only for trains, the memory of what we had built there lingered. For many of us, those tiled platforms and damp walls were not just stations. They were the places where our families survived, where friendships were born, where courage was tested and proven. I would sometimes walk through a station and pause at a familiar corner. I could almost hear it still, the muffled laughter of children playing marbles, the low hum of voices sharing tea, the thin strains of a violin played by a stranger who wanted to bring light to the dark. The war had tried to strip us of humanity, but in those tunnels we had stitched it back together, one act of kindness at a time. The children carried the memories most vividly. Some grew up remembering the tube as their playground, the place where they read their first book, or where they first learned what solidarity meant. Others remembered the fear, Dust falling from the ceilings, mothers pulling them close, the ground trembling as if the world itself was tearing apart. But whether in joy or in fear, those nights underground shaped them. They learned resilience at an age when most children should have known only games and schoolbooks. When people today speak of the Blitz spirit, they imagine fire wardens with helmets, rescue workers pulling survivors from rubble, women in factories keeping the war machine alive. And all of that is true. But just as true is the spirit of the underground, the quiet determination of thousands who chose, night after night, to descend into the earth and face their fear together. The tube shelters became part of our collective memory. They appeared in books, in films, in whispered stories passed down at family tables. Survivors told their children and grandchildren, "We lived under the city. We shared everything and we endured." Some children, who once fell asleep to the sound of trains and bombs, later became leaders, writers, and teachers who spoke of unity in times of crisis. Perhaps the most powerful legacy is this. The underground shelters taught us that survival is not just about walls and roofs. It is about people, about the stranger who offers you half their bread, about the nurse who tends a fevered child, about the man who begins a trembling song and finds 100 voices joining his own. That is what saved us, not the tiles or the tunnels, but each other. Even now, decades later, when I descend the stairs of a London underground station, I feel it, the echo of those nights. The rush of footsteps may be commuters now, not refugees, but the spirit of those who once filled these spaces still lingers. The walls remember. The city remembers, and so do I. In the end, the underground nation was never meant to exist, but it did, and it carried us through the darkest nights. It taught us that in the deepest shadows, humanity can still shine, and that memory, like the tunnels themselves, will endure as long as London stands.